My name is Elena. I'm 29. And 2 weeks ago, my mother stood in our driveway screaming that I was nothing but a leech living off them. Then she grabbed my bags. Didn't hand them to me. Didn't even set them down. She threw them across the concrete and yelled, "Go leech somewhere else." And I did. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't explain myself for the hundredth time. I just picked up my suitcase, walked past her as she kept ranting, and got into my friend's car without looking back. That was the moment I realized the woman who raised me didn't see me as a daughter anymore, just a burden she wanted gone. But what my mother didn't realize was that the leech she kicked out was the same person who had quietly kept their entire financial life running for years. Their online banking, their bill payments, their tax portal, their insurance accounts, everything they depended on, without ever learning how any of it worked. So when I left, all of that stayed exactly where I left it. 2 weeks later, my phone lit up with a call from my dad, then another, then a text. "Why did the bank freeze our account? We can't access anything." I stared at the screen for a long minute. Then I typed back 2 words that said everything. "Ask the leech." If you think that's wild, trust me, it's nothing compared to what happened after. Families can ignore you for years, but the moment you stop fixing their messes, everything falls apart fast. There was a time when my life in Seattle felt predictable, almost steady, even if I didn't always appreciate it. I had a small apartment, a routine I could manage, and a job that made sense to me. Working in graphic design wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me a feeling of independence I never had growing up. When the company collapsed after being absorbed by a bigger firm, everything shifted at once. One morning, I was preparing campaigns for a client, and by the afternoon, I was packing my desk with a printed notice that my position had been eliminated. Losing that job didn't just cut off my income, it shook my sense of direction. I tried to adjust, convincing myself it would only take a few weeks to find something new. It didn't. The cost of living in Seattle made every month heavier, and freelance work came in irregular waves that kept me afloat, but never secure. I stretched my savings as long as I could, avoiding the idea of leaving until it became obvious I had no choice. Calling my mother, my mom Margaret, was the part I dreaded most. My father, my dad Arthur, rarely interfered, but Margaret's voice always carried the weight of judgment even when she wasn't trying to. I explained that Seattle was becoming impossible to manage and that I needed a temporary place until I found stable work again. She didn't hide the hesitation in her tone, but she agreed. I told myself that was enough. Returning to Ohio felt like stepping backward into a life I thought I had left behind. The house was the same, yet somehow smaller, tighter, as if the air inside carried old expectations I didn't want to wear anymore. My younger brother Lucas had already carved out his own path in New York, and his success was a constant topic of comparison in our family. I didn't resent him for it, but the way it was used against me lingered like a shadow waiting for the right light to appear. The first few days at home were quiet, almost too quiet. Margaret watched me with a mix of concern and suspicion, as if she was waiting for me to confirm some narrative she had already constructed. Arthur offered polite reminders about keeping my resume updated, but rarely said more. I tried to settle in without taking up space, telling myself this was temporary, a pause I didn't want, but had to accept. It didn't take long for Margaret to create a set of rules designed to emphasize that I was no longer the daughter who once lived there. Curfews didn't make sense for an adult, yet they appeared. Expectations about chores were laid out as if she was preparing a checklist. She wasn't hostile, but she was methodical, drawing lines in the sand without acknowledging what they implied. My Aunt Linda visited occasionally, and her eyes always seemed to scan me, searching for cracks. Conversations between her and Margaret often drifted toward subtle remarks about who was stable, who was thriving, and who needed to get their act together. I knew exactly who they meant, even if they never said my name in those moments. During that period, my closest support came from my friend Sarah, who reminded me that setbacks didn't erase everything I had worked for. I clung to that thought each time I refreshed job boards or sent applications into digital voids. The weight of those weeks didn't come from chaos, but from a tightening calm. The kind that makes you realize something inside your family has shifted in a way you can't easily undo. In the weeks after I moved back into my parents' house, the routine settled in faster than I wanted to admit. Mornings began with the sound of my mom moving through the kitchen and the quiet knowledge that if I stayed in bed too long, she would read it as proof I wasn't trying. I got up, moved around wiped counters that didn't need it yet, and tried to stay just busy enough to feel like I had a right to be there. I treated usefulness like currency. If I handled the dishes, the laundry, the trash, the grocery runs, then at least I could tell myself I was paying some kind of rent. It didn't stop the questions about job searches or timelines, but it gave me something solid to point to when my own doubts started circling. I might not have a title anymore, but the house stayed functional, and I was the one keeping it that way. My dad drifted around the edges of that arrangement. He went to work, came home settled into his familiar spot on the couch, and let the evening blur into the television. When something in the house broke and later stopped being a problem, he seemed content to accept that as the natural order of things. His lack of reaction was almost comforting compared to my mom's constant measuring, but it also reinforced a quiet truth. As long as everything worked, nobody was going to ask who was holding it together. Lucas showed up first in stories instead of in person. My mom always had a new update about his office, his view, his plans. Each detail was presented like a small achievement pinned to an invisible board. I could hear the shape of the comparison even when she didn't say it out loud. He had left and stayed gone with a neat life built in another city. I had left and returned with uncertainty, and that alone seemed to define me in their eyes. Behind all of that, there was a different kind of mess building in the background. Bills were crammed into a drawer, bank letters stacked in loose piles, scraps of paper with half-remembered passwords stuck in random places. My parents had been improvising their way through online accounts for years, and it showed. They didn't say they needed help, but every time my mom muttered about how complicated everything had become, the expectations settled on me like a weight I hadn't agreed to carry. So I started fixing it one login at a time. I set up their online banking so payments wouldn't slip past unnoticed, organized their cards and utilities into a system that actually matched reality, and created a single document where everything could be found in seconds instead of hours. Soon, every notification, every security code, every digital problem came through me first. They enjoyed the stability without seeing the work. When my Aunt Linda mentioned how much more put together the house seemed, my mom accepted the compliment and shifted the conversation back to Lucas's latest success. Sarah was the only one who knew how much time I was spending behind the scenes. Our late-night messages and quick drives around town became my reminder that I existed outside of this narrow role. On the surface, nothing dramatic had happened yet, but each quiet favor I did without acknowledgement added another thin layer to the pressure building under my skin. I could feel something in me tightening even if I couldn't name it yet. There was a kind of stillness that settled over the house in the days leading up to the dinner my mom insisted on hosting. Nothing dramatic was said yet. Something inside me sensed a shift. It felt like the air tightened around every small mistake I made, as if even the way I moved from room to room had become part of some silent evaluation. I tried to ignore it, but the tension threaded itself into everything, creating a pressure I couldn't quite name. My mom threw herself into preparations with an intensity that made the whole day feel staged. She cared about how everything would look, not because she enjoyed gatherings, but because she wanted proof that we were a family in control of our lives. My dad drifted around that energy like a passenger, never directly participating but never stepping away. Each time I passed him, he seemed lost in thought. Yet I couldn't tell if he sensed anything brewing or if he had simply learned not to notice. What unsettled me most was the way my mom moved whenever Lucas came up in conversation. Even the possibility of him visiting brought a kind of brightness into her face that I hadn't seen since before I moved home. His presence carried weight in this house not because he demanded it, but because she placed him at the center of everything. I felt myself shrinking in advance of his arrival, preparing for the familiar imbalance that always followed him through the door. My Aunt Linda confirmed she would be coming too, which added another layer to the unease. She had a talent for seeing only what supported her assumptions, and she often treated me like a minor inconvenience in a story that wasn't about me. Whenever she and my mom got together, I felt myself fade into the background, useful, only when it benefited their conversations. I knew sitting through a dinner with both of them would require an emotional steadiness I wasn't sure I had left. As the afternoon unfolded, I found myself moving through chores without thinking. Setting the table wasn't a task as much as a way to steady my hands. I placed each item carefully, trying to create some sense of order even if it felt temporary. The clatter of silverware and the faint hum of the oven blended into a rhythm that kept my thoughts from spiraling too far ahead. I told myself that if I focused on small actions, the evening might pass without becoming heavier than it already felt. When Lucas finally arrived, the energy in the house shifted instantly. My mom's warmth grew almost exaggerated, her voice lifting in a way that was reserved only for him. Watching it unfold stirred something in me I didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't jealousy. It was the quiet realization that I had become a supporting character in my own home. No one had said anything unkind yet, but the imbalance was loud enough to echo without words. Linda entered with her usual confidence, scanning the room, as if checking whether expectations had been met. Her approval lingered on the things my mom had arranged, not on the work it took to prepare them. I felt her glance brush past me, brief and dismissive, and my chest tightened with the familiar strain of trying not to take up too much space. I kept my posture calm, telling myself that holding steady was the only thing within my control. As we all moved toward the dining room, the heaviness that had been building settled quietly between us. My mom watched Lucas with unmistakable pride, while my dad took his seat with the same resigned patience that had become part of him. Linda observed everything with that sharp, knowing look she used whenever she was preparing to draw conclusions about someone else's life. In that quiet moment before anyone spoke, I felt the pressure around me reach a point where staying composed became its own quiet battle. The evening hadn't yet turned, but the foundation beneath it had already begun to shift in a way I could feel more than see. There was a strange quietness in the room, once everyone had settled at the table, the kind that felt too controlled to be natural. Plates were passed around, and the usual clatter of silverware seemed muted under the weight of careful smiles. I could feel myself tensing as each gesture from my mom grew sharper, as if she were hosting a performance rather than a family meal. The atmosphere carried a tightness that made it difficult to breathe normally, and I found myself bracing without knowing exactly for what. Lucas talked about his life in New York with the ease of someone who understood his place in the family. Every detail he shared seemed to please my mom, and watching her lean toward him with proud anticipation felt like standing outside a window looking in. It wasn't new, but something about it hit differently that evening. Maybe it was the fragile balance I had been trying to maintain, or maybe it was the way Linda listened with that knowing expression she reserved for stories that confirmed her expectations. My dad stayed mostly quiet, nodding along and offering small reactions that blended into the background. His silence wasn't malicious. It was a comfortable pattern he had lived in for years. Sometimes I wondered if he ever noticed how uneven the room became when the rest of us were together. Other times I thought he simply chose not to acknowledge anything that introduced discomfort into his routine. As the conversation continued, the tension around me sharpened. I felt like an object placed in the wrong setting, visible but not considered. My mom's glances in my direction carried a mix of impatience and scrutiny, as if she were waiting for me to interrupt a moment she didn't want disturbed. I tried to stay focused on my plate, hoping that keeping quiet would make me less of a target for whatever judgment was brewing beneath the surface. But the turning point arrived without warning. It started with a simple shift in tone, an edge in my mom's voice that signaled the conversation was about to tilt. She looked at me in a way that stripped away any pretense of hospitality, and I sensed that her patience had reached its limits. The room tightened further as everyone else grew still, waiting for whatever came next. What followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air. The words themselves weren't complicated yet. They carried a weight that settled in my chest. The accusation wasn't about anything specific I had done in the moment. It was about the narrative she had been building around me since I moved back home. Her tone made it clear that she saw me not as someone navigating a difficult period, but as a problem that had overstayed its welcome. The moment landed with a heaviness that went far beyond embarrassment. I felt something inside me shift in a direction I couldn't pull back from. There was no anger at first, only a slow realization that the balance had tipped past the point of repair. I kept my expression steady, but the pressure behind my ribs made it difficult to swallow. The humiliation wasn't about the words themselves. It was about the ease with which she said them in front of people who barely knew the reality of my situation. Linda's expression tightened with a kind of performative concern, yet I could sense the judgment hidden beneath it. Lucas looked caught between loyalty and discomfort, his confidence dimming just slightly as he glanced toward me. My dad's face shifted into something unreadable, a mixture of confusion and resignation that told me he wasn't prepared to intervene. The silence that followed was almost physical. It stretched across the table, thick and unavoidable. I sat in it, letting the weight settle, realizing that nothing about this moment surprised me as much as it confirmed what I had been trying not to admit. Something fundamental in me withdrew then, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Whatever I had been holding onto in hopes of keeping peace wasn't enough to anchor me anymore. Morning came with a kind of heaviness that made everything feel slower, as if the night had pulled something vital out of me. I moved through the house quietly, trying not to disturb anyone, though part of me sensed that nothing I did could soften the tension still lingering from the evening before. My thoughts kept circling around the unresolved weight sitting behind my mother's anger, and I wondered how long it would take before she directed it toward me again. While I prepared my things, a calmness settled over me that didn't feel like acceptance, but more like resignation. The house had stopped feeling like a shared space, and walking through each room felt like moving through a place that no longer held my shape. I had tried to convince myself that I still belonged somewhere in this family, yet each interaction chipped away at that illusion a little more. By the time I made it downstairs, I sensed an invisible line drawn between the version of me they wanted and the one I actually was. My mom's presence in the kitchen confirmed that the atmosphere hadn't shifted in my favor. Her movements were deliberate and clipped, as if she were preserving her anger for when she thought it would make the most impact. I could feel the tension rolling off her even without words, and unease crept in as I realized where the morning was heading. I kept my distance, hoping that silence would hold the situation together long enough for me to gather myself before anything escalated. But the moment didn't hold. She turned toward me with an intensity that made the room shrink. The frustration she carried from the night before hadn't settled. It had multiplied, sharpening into something she seemed ready to unleash. Even without speaking, her expression said more than any argument could. I recognized the look too well. It was the same one she used whenever she needed someone to blame, and I had become the easiest target. The confrontation unfolded in a way that felt inevitable. Her disappointment pressed against me like a weight I couldn't push back. The way she looked at me made it clear this wasn't about anything that had happened recently, but about whatever story she had rewritten in her mind. My chest tightened as the realization took hold. Nothing I said or did would ever shift the narrative she clung to. The role she had assigned to me wasn't something she intended to reevaluate. As her frustration swelled, the situation tipped past a point I could manage. A sense of detachment washed over me, creating a distance that made the moment feel strangely muted. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. There was nothing inside me left to explain. Instead, I watched her anger build as if it belonged to someone else's story, not mine. Each second made it clear that the connection between us had reached its breaking point, and I no longer had the strength to carry what wasn't mine. The moment she lashed out, something inside me went still. Not in fear, but in realization. Her anger wasn't about me. It was about the loss of control she felt. I had grown into someone she didn't understand, someone she couldn't shape. And instead of facing that, she projected every insecurity she carried onto me. The accusations cut deeper not because of their content, but because of the ease with which she delivered them. It was a clarity I hadn't let myself confront until then. In the silence that followed, I felt my resolve solidify. There was no coming back from the shift that had just taken place. The bond I had tried so hard to maintain had been damaged beyond repair. Not by disagreement, but by the ease with which she disregarded everything I had endured. The space between us could no longer be bridged by patience or understanding. I walked away slowly, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Each step felt measured, deliberate, as if I were leaving behind more than just a room. I could sense the weight of finality settling around me, carrying a mix of sadness and relief. The realization that I had reached my limit wasn't a moment of weakness. It was the first time I had chosen myself over the role I had been expected to play. There was no dramatic ending, no raised voice chasing after me, only the steady confirmation that whatever existed between us had fractured for good. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't question whether walking away was the right choice. Part of me knew that once I walked away from my mother that morning, something fundamental had already ended. The house didn't feel like a pause anymore. It felt like a place I was passing through on my way out. The distance between us wasn't just emotional at that point. It was preparing to become physical, too. It didn't take long for everything to snap. The tension that had been hanging over the house finally found a target, and she made it clear I was no longer welcome. The message wasn't subtle or careful. It came with the finality of someone who had decided she was done pretending. In her mind, I had shifted from struggling adult child to permanent burden, and she wanted that burden removed. By the time my things were shoved out of my room and pushed toward the door, my shock had already burned out. I watched the last pieces of my life in that house reduced to luggage, and what hurt more than the action itself was how easy it seemed for her. I had imagined that if I ever left like this, there would be some hesitation, some trace of the years we had shared. Instead, it felt like erasing a chalkboard. Leaving with my bags felt strangely calm. Sarah became my lifeline, offering a couch and a reminder that none of this defined my worth. For a short stretch, my life turned into a patchwork of borrowed spaces and improvised routines. I bounced between Sarah's apartment and a brief stay on Jason's floor, using each night to remind myself that survival didn't require anyone's approval, but my own. The instability was exhausting, but it came with one important shift. I no longer felt trapped. Work became the anchor I clung to. I took on small projects wherever I could find them, stitching together income from business owners who needed help online but didn't know where to start. Each assignment was a step away from the version of myself my family had chosen to see. When a recruiter reached out with a remote position that matched what I had done in Seattle, it felt less like luck and more like the first real acknowledgement that my skills still mattered. Accepting that job gave me enough stability to sign a lease on a small studio in Columbus. The place wasn't impressive by any outside standard, but to me, it represented something my parents had never truly given me. Space that belonged entirely to me. Setting up my laptop on a cheap table and arranging my few belongings on shelves felt like reclaiming ownership over my own life in a way I hadn't experienced before. Even after I left, the systems I had built for my parents kept working in the background. Notifications still reached the email address I had once used to manage their accounts. Security alerts and reminders flowed through my phone like echoes of responsibilities I no longer held. I ignored most of them, reminding myself that I was no longer their safety net, even if the remnants of that role still clung to my digital life. The real crash came a few weeks after I had settled into my new place. A string of missed calls from my dad appeared on my screen, followed by a message I didn't need to open to understand the panic behind it. Their access to money had been disrupted, and suddenly, the invisible work I used to do had become very visible in its absence. I sent a short response that pointed him back to the label my mother had thrown at me and put my phone down with shaking hands. In the days that followed, the fallout spread through the family without my involvement. I heard through distant channels that bills had been missed, that automatic payments had failed, that confusion over passwords and recovery links had turned simple tasks into crisis. They hired professionals to untangle the mess. And for the first time, the support they took for granted came with a price tag attached to every hour. It hurt to know I could have fixed things quickly, but it hurt more to remember how little that effort had ever counted. My dad eventually reached out again, not just with panic, but with something closer to desperation. The message between the lines was clear. They wanted me to step back into the role I had once filled, to quietly repair what had broken and return to being the unseen structure under their comfort. This time, I didn't even consider it. I had already learned that stepping back in would only reset the cycle and teach them that there were no real consequences for how they treated me. Refusing to return to that role wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of self-respect. I made it clear, at least to myself, that I would no longer be their unpaid manager, their emergency contact, or their silent problem solver. They had chosen to see me as a drain, and I no longer had the energy to prove otherwise to people who preferred their own version of the story over the truth standing in front of them. As time passed, I built something that had nothing to do with them. My work stabilized. I found a rhythm in my days, the kind that didn't revolve around anticipating someone else's needs. I began volunteering with older adults who genuinely wanted to learn how to navigate the online world, and every grateful smile reminded me how different it felt to help people who actually saw the effort behind the outcome. Cutting contact with my parents wasn't a single dramatic gesture. It was a series of small decisions not to answer, not to explain, not to chase closure from people who had never offered accountability. The quiet that followed was unfamiliar at first, but over time it became a kind of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. If there is anything I carry from all of this, it's the understanding that being useful is not the same as being valued. You can hold a family's life together from behind the scenes and still be treated like excess weight the moment they need someone to blame. Walking away doesn't erase what you did for them, but it does protect what is left of you. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with the label someone throws at you is step far enough away that it no longer sticks to your skin. Maybe this story touched something inside you, a moment you lived, a feeling you once carried, or a silence you've been holding onto for far too long. We often grow up believing that family is an unbreakable bond, a sanctuary where we are seen, understood, and safe. But for some of us, that sanctuary becomes a courtroom where we are constantly on trial, forced to prove our worth through service, silence, or submission. Elena's journey isn't just about financial accounts or a shouting match in a driveway. It's about the heartbreaking realization that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally actually love us conditionally, based on what we provide, not who we are. It's about the usefulness trap, where we make ourselves indispensable in hopes that if we do enough, fix enough, and carry enough, we will finally be accepted. But as Elena found out, when you are only valued for your utility, you become disposable the moment you stop functioning perfectly. There is a profound grief in walking away from family. It's not a victory lap. It's a survival tactic. It involves mourning the parents you have while letting go of the parents you wished they were. It means accepting that you cannot explain your reality to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Margaret and Arthur didn't lose a daughter because of a fight. They lost her because they failed to see her humanity separate from her helpfulness. Perhaps you are currently in that driveway, metaphorically speaking. Maybe you are standing there with your bags packed, wondering if you're making a mistake, wondering if you should turn back and fix things one more time. Or maybe you've already left and you're sitting in your own version of a quiet studio apartment, feeling the phantom vibrations of a phone you no longer need to answer. If you are, I want you to know that choosing yourself is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of preservation. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to be messy, uncertain, and useless to others while still being valuable to yourself. The peace Elena found wasn't in revenge or in watching her parents struggle. It was in the quiet reclamation of her own narrative. This story is a reminder that labels like leech or burden are often confessions from the people throwing them, confessions of their own fear, their own lack of control, and their own inability to love without strings attached. Don't let those labels define your destination. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the invisible glue holding a fragile structure together, I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts or your own experience in the comments below. Your story matters, and speaking it out loud is the first step in breaking the cycle. And please tell me where you're watching from so I can create more stories just for you. Until next time, take care of yourself, because you are worth more than what you can do for others.